I warned a fake HOA patrol to leave my land, but they refused and chose the wrong homeowner. They thought they had power until they discovered my hidden experience and the truth behind their authority. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first warning I gave them was polite. The second was recorded. By the third, they had already made the mistake that would destroy their entire operation. I was replacing a broken cedar rail along the eastern boundary of my property when I heard tires grinding over the private road behind me. The sound didn't belong there. Delivery trucks stopped at the gate. Neighbors called first. Whoever was coming toward me had ignored both the sign and the chain stretched across the entrance. I set down my drill and watched a white SUV emerge between the pines. A blue and gold emblem covered the doors: Ridgeview HOA Patrol. Amber lights flashed across the roof, even though there was no emergency. The vehicle rolled past the private property sign, crossed the cattle guard, and stopped 20 feet from where I stood. 3 people stepped out wearing matching navy jackets. The woman in front carried a clipboard, a radio, and the kind of expression that suggested she had never heard the word no without taking it personally. She was in her early 50s, blonde hair pinned neatly behind her head, mirrored sunglasses hiding her eyes. Her name tag read Meredith Caldwell, patrol supervisor. I had never met her, but I recognized the performance immediately. The uniform, the marked vehicle, the deliberate silence while her 2 companions spread out behind her. Everything was designed to make a homeowner feel surrounded before a single accusation was made. Meredith looked past me toward the barn, the equipment shed, and the gravel access lane running through my land. "Grant Holloway?" she asked. "That's right." She flipped a page on her clipboard. "We've received reports of unauthorized agricultural activity and non-compliant structures." The wind carried the smell of pine sap and cold soil between us. Somewhere inside the barn, one of my horses kicked lightly against a stall door. "Received reports from whom?" I asked. "The association." "Which association?" Her mouth tightened. "Ridgeview Estates." I glanced back toward the entrance. Ridgeview Estates began almost half a mile east of my property line. My land had been recorded separately for more than 30 years. It had no HOA covenant, no shared easement agreement, and no contractual connection to Meredith or the organization printed across her jacket. She either didn't know that, or she believed the costume made the distinction irrelevant. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. "Turn around and leave the way you came." One of the men behind her gave a short laugh. Meredith removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp and irritated, as though my refusal had violated some private rule she expected the world to follow. "We have authority to inspect properties affecting community standards. Not this property." She stepped closer and extended a yellow form toward me. At the top, beneath the HOA logo, were the words "Notice of Immediate Compliance." "You'll need to sign this acknowledgement." I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked at the SUV, the flashing lights, the radio clipped to her shoulder, and the small body camera mounted crookedly on one patrolman's chest. Every detail told me the same thing. They wanted to resemble law enforcement without ever directly claiming to be law enforcement. That distinction mattered more than Meredith realized. "This is your final warning," I said. "Leave my land." She smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Holloway, you need to understand who has authority here." I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and started recording. "Go ahead," I told her. "Explain it clearly." For the first time, the 2 men behind her stopped smiling. Meredith didn't. She lifted her clipboard, turned toward my barn, and ordered them to begin taking photographs. That was when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system, and they had just chosen the one landowner who knew exactly how fake authority collapsed once every word, badge, and trespass was preserved as evidence. The biggest mistake Meredith Caldwell made was assuming a uniform could create authority. She never considered that the person she was confronting might understand the rules better than the people pretending to enforce them. Before that patrol truck ever crossed my property line, I had already noticed the signs. It started with small things that most people would ignore. Strange vehicles parked near the entrance road. People taking photographs from outside my fence. Notes left on nearby properties warning residents about community compliance. At first, I thought Ridgeview Estates was simply becoming more aggressive with their neighborhood management. But then I looked closer. My property was not part of Ridgeview Estates. It never had been. My land records went back decades before the neighborhood existed. The boundary lines were clear and the documents were public. Yet somehow, Meredith Caldwell and her patrol team believed they could expand their influence beyond those lines. I had spent years working with property investigations before retiring. During that time, I learned something important. Real authority does not need a costume. It does not need flashing lights, official-looking paperwork, or people standing behind it trying to appear intimidating. Real authority comes from documentation, from jurisdiction, from the law. That was why Meredith's approach bothered me so much. She wasn't asking questions. She was performing control. After the first encounter, I decided not to confront her emotionally. I knew exactly what people like Meredith expected. They expected anger. They expected arguments. They expected someone to lose patience and create the reaction they could use against them. Instead, I started watching. I checked the patrol vehicle. I recorded every visit. I saved every notice they left behind. I documented every time they stepped onto my property without permission. The more information I collected, the clearer the pattern became. Meredith wasn't enforcing rules. She was creating the appearance of enforcement. A week after the first confrontation, she returned. This time, she brought 2 additional patrol members and a thicker folder. The SUV stopped in the same place. The same doors opened. The same performance began. "Mr. Holloway," Meredith said, walking toward me. "We're here to follow up on your refusal to cooperate." I looked at the camera on my phone, already recording. "I cooperated by asking you to leave private property." Her expression changed slightly. "You continue to misunderstand the situation." I almost smiled. Because she was right about one thing. Someone did misunderstand the situation. But it wasn't me. Meredith handed me another document. This one included language about possible fines and further action. She pointed toward my barn and driveway. "These areas need to be reviewed for compliance." "Reviewed by who?" I asked. She paused for half a second. It was brief, but I noticed it. "By the association. The association that doesn't own this land." Her confidence returned quickly. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." That sentence told me everything. People who have real authority explain it. People who don't usually demand that you accept it. I took the document and placed it carefully in my folder. "You should leave while this is still a conversation," I said. Meredith stared at me, clearly frustrated that intimidation wasn't working. She turned to her team and told them to continue documenting the property. I watched them walk around with their cameras and clipboards, completely unaware that every action was creating a record. They thought they were building a case against me. They didn't realize they were building the evidence that would eventually expose them. I knew the moment Meredith smiled that she wasn't looking for cooperation. She was looking for surrender. And the one thing she didn't understand was that some people don't surrender when they know the truth is on their side. The days after her second visit were quiet, but I knew quiet didn't mean finished. People like Meredith Caldwell rarely walked away when someone refused to obey. They simply changed tactics. Every morning, I checked the cameras installed around my property. I reviewed recordings, saved timestamps, and organized everything into separate folders. The more I looked, the more I noticed a pattern. The patrol team always arrived during the same hours. They parked in the same location. They carried the same paperwork. But none of them could answer the simplest question. What gave them the legal right to be there? That question followed them everywhere. I decided to visit the county records office, not because I needed permission to live on my own land, but because I wanted to understand exactly how far Meredith's confidence extended. The building smelled like old paper and coffee, the kind of place where decades of property history sat quietly inside filing cabinets. I requested the official maps, ownership records, and any agreements connected to Ridgeview Estates. The clerk behind the counter searched through the system and looked back at me with a confused expression. "Your property isn't listed under their association," she said. "I know," I replied. I'm trying to find out why they think it is. After several minutes, the answer became even clearer. There was no shared maintenance agreement, no easement, no enforcement authority, nothing. Meredith's patrol had no legal connection to my land. They had simply decided that looking official was enough to make people believe them. I printed copies of every relevant document and placed them carefully into a folder. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Evidence works best when you allow people to reveal themselves completely. 3 days later, Meredith gave me exactly what I was waiting for. She returned just before sunset. The orange light reflected across her SUV windows as she parked beside my driveway. This time, she came alone. No team, no witnesses, just her clipboard and that same confident expression. "Mr. Holloway," she said, stepping toward my gate. "You're making this situation difficult for everyone." I stayed behind the fence. "I've only asked one thing. Stay off my property." She sighed like I was exhausting her patience. "You don't seem to understand how these communities work." "Actually," I said, "I understand them very well." For the first time, her expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. "You believe that because you own this land, nobody can question you." "No," I answered. "I believe that because I own this land, people need permission before entering it." Meredith lifted another form. "This is your final compliance notice." I looked at the paper but didn't take it. A notice from an organization with no jurisdiction over my property? Her smile disappeared. "Careful with your accusations." "I'm not accusing anyone," I said. "I'm documenting." That word bothered her more than anything else I had said. Because documentation removes the power of intimidation. It turns arguments into facts. It turns confidence into evidence. Meredith looked at the camera above my gate and then back at me. "You really think you figured this out?" she asked. I closed the folder in my hand. "I think you're about to." She left without another word. But as her SUV disappeared down the road, I knew something had changed. She wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She was trying to protect herself. And that was when I realized the fake HOA patrol wasn't prepared for a fight. They were prepared for homeowners who gave up before asking questions. The moment Meredith Caldwell realized I was not backing down was the moment she stopped pretending this was a simple inspection. It became a battle over control, and she was about to discover that fake authority disappears when real documentation enters the room. After collecting the county records, I returned home with a clearer picture of what was happening. The documents were simple, but they carried more weight than anything Meredith had brought to my property. My land was mine. Ridgeview Estates had no legal claim over it. The patrol team had no inspection rights. The warnings they delivered were nothing more than attempts to create pressure through appearance. But I also knew something else. People like Meredith rarely stop after being challenged once. They usually escalate because admitting they were wrong would mean admitting they never had the power they claimed to have. I didn't have to wait long. The following Monday morning, I received an email from an address connected to Ridgeview Estates. The message accused me of refusing community cooperation and stated that additional action would be taken if I continued to ignore association requirements. I read it twice before closing my laptop. The words were carefully chosen. They avoided saying they owned my property. They avoided saying they had legal enforcement authority. Instead, they used vague phrases designed to make people feel obligated. It was a strategy built on confusion. That afternoon, I called the county office again and asked one question. Has Ridgeview Estates ever been granted authority over properties outside its boundaries? The answer came quickly. No. That single word confirmed everything I already suspected. I saved the call details, printed the email, and added them to my growing file. Every time Meredith tried to intimidate me, she created another piece of evidence. A few days later, she made her biggest mistake. She organized what she called a property compliance review. A small crowd gathered near my entrance road. Some were Ridgeview residents who had heard her side of the story. Others were simply curious. Meredith arrived wearing the same patrol jacket, carrying the same clipboard, and speaking with the same confidence. She wanted an audience this time. She wanted witnesses to see her as the person in charge. "Mr. Holloway," she announced loudly, "we are giving you one final opportunity to cooperate before this moves forward." I looked around at the people watching. They weren't seeing a legal process. They were seeing a performance. Moves forward to where? I asked. Meredith hesitated. Further enforcement action. By whom? Another pause. It was small, but everyone noticed it. By the association. I pulled a folder from my truck and held it at my side. Then maybe everyone here should see something. The crowd became quiet. I didn't open the folder yet. I didn't need to. The purpose wasn't to argue. It was to show that I had prepared. Meredith looked at the folder and her expression changed. She realized the conversation had shifted. For weeks, she had been collecting information about me. Now she understood I had been collecting information about her. "Are you threatening the association?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I'm protecting myself." That answer bothered her more than anger would have. Because anger could be dismissed. Preparation could not. She ended the meeting shortly afterward, telling everyone that the matter was still under review. But as the patrol vehicle drove away, I watched Meredith looking through the window toward my property. The confidence was still there, but something underneath it had weakened. She finally understood that the person she thought she was controlling had never been playing the same game. She was trying to win with intimidation. I was preparing to win with the truth. The moment I opened the folder in front of Meredith, I saw something I had been waiting for since the beginning. Not anger. Not fear. A small crack of uncertainty. She finally realized this wasn't about a homeowner refusing to cooperate. It was about a false authority being challenged by facts. After the public confrontation at my gate, I knew Meredith would either disappear or make one final attempt to regain control. People who build power on intimidation rarely walk away quietly. They need the last word. They need to convince themselves and everyone watching that they were still in charge. 2 days later, that attempt arrived in my mailbox. It was a formal-looking letter with Ridgeview Estates branding across the top. The language sounded serious at first glance. It mentioned community protection, property standards, and possible legal consequences. But I had learned something important about documents like these. The appearance mattered less than the details. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning sunlight coming through the window and read every sentence carefully. Then I compared it with the county records sitting beside me. The same pattern appeared again. They used words designed to create fear, but they avoided the words that would prove actual authority. No ownership rights. No recorded agreement. No legal enforcement power. Just pressure. I placed the letter into my evidence folder with the others. By then, it had become more than paperwork. It was a timeline of every decision Meredith made. Every visit. Every warning. Every moment where she believed confidence could replace permission. That afternoon, I contacted the county property office and requested a written statement confirming the boundaries of my land and the limits of Ridgeview's authority. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted the truth recorded by the people whose job was to maintain it. A few days later, I received the response. The statement was clear. My property existed outside Ridgeview Estates jurisdiction. Any attempt to enforce HOA rules on my land had no legal foundation. I printed multiple copies and placed the document carefully into the folder. The final piece was now in place. But Meredith wasn't finished. She scheduled another meeting, this time inviting several Ridgeview residents. Her message claimed the purpose was to resolve ongoing community concerns. I knew exactly what that meant. She wanted to control the story before the facts reached everyone else. The meeting took place near the neighborhood clubhouse. I arrived early and watched people gather around, whispering about the homeowner who supposedly refused to follow the rules. Meredith stood near the entrance, greeting people like she was leading an official hearing. When she saw me carrying the folder, her expression became guarded. "Grant," she said, "I hope you came prepared to listen." I looked around at the crowd. I did. She began explaining that communities depended on cooperation and that some homeowners misunderstood their responsibilities. She never mentioned my property by name at first. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Then she turned toward me. "You have repeatedly rejected reasonable requests from the association." I opened the folder. "Actually, I have repeatedly asked for proof of authority." The room became quiet. I handed copies of the county statement to the people closest to me. They started reading. The confident expressions around the room slowly changed. Confusion replaced certainty. Meredith stepped forward. "Those documents don't change the situation." I looked directly at her. "They change everything." For the first time since this began, Meredith had no immediate response. The person who had entered my land believing she controlled the conversation was now standing in a room where everyone was asking the same question. If she had no authority over my property, why had she acted like she did? And that was the question she could no longer avoid. The day Meredith Caldwell realized she had lost control wasn't the day she saw my documents. It was the day she understood that every threat she made had created a trail leading directly back to her. After the meeting at the clubhouse, I expected Meredith to slow down. Instead, she accelerated. People who build their confidence on appearances don't usually admit defeat when the facts appear. They search for another way to maintain the illusion. 3 mornings later, I noticed something unusual. A different vehicle parked near the entrance of my property. It wasn't the same HOA patrol SUV, but I recognized the person sitting inside. One of Meredith's associates was watching my driveway. He wasn't approaching. He wasn't speaking to me. He was simply observing. That told me everything. They knew the situation was changing. They knew the documents had damaged their story. But instead of stepping back, they were trying to find another angle. I continued documenting everything. I installed additional cameras facing the entrance, saved every message, and kept a detailed record of every interaction. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I understood something Meredith didn't. When someone creates a false version of reality, the truth needs a record. A few days later, Meredith finally made her move. She sent another notice, but this one was different. It wasn't just a warning. It was an accusation. The letter claimed that I was interfering with community operations and creating unnecessary conflict. I read those words while sitting at my desk, the same desk where I had organized every piece of evidence against her. It almost felt like she was writing my case for me. She had moved from pretending to have authority over my property to trying to punish me for questioning it. That was the moment I decided it was time to stop reacting. I contacted the county legal office and provided copies of everything. The response was exactly what I expected. They reviewed the documents, the notices, the recordings, and the timeline I had created. Then they asked one question. Why did this organization believe they had enforcement power over private property? I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, they never had one. They only had confidence. And confidence without legal foundation eventually collapses. A week later, I received a request to attend a formal review meeting. This time, it wasn't organized by Meredith. It was being handled by officials who actually had jurisdiction. When I arrived, I noticed the difference immediately. There were no dramatic entrances. No patrol vehicle. No matching jackets designed to create intimidation. Just people with documents, questions, and the responsibility to find the truth. Meredith arrived 15 minutes late. She walked in carrying the same clipboard she had carried onto my property weeks earlier. But the room felt different. The confidence that once filled her voice was gone. She looked at the papers in front of the officials and then looked at me. "Grant, I think this has gone too far," she said quietly. I remembered those first words she spoke to me on my land. The certainty, the authority, the assumption that I would simply obey. "I agree," I replied. "It went too far when you entered private property without permission." The room became silent. Every decision Meredith made was now being viewed through the same lens she used on homeowners. Evidence, documentation, accountability. She had spent weeks trying to prove I was the problem. Instead, she had created the exact record that showed she was the one who crossed the line. And for the first time, the fake authority she built around herself started disappearing in front of everyone. The room was silent, but not because nobody had anything to say. It was silent because everyone was finally looking at the same evidence Meredith Caldwell had spent weeks trying to ignore. The formal review meeting continued for nearly an hour. Every document on the table told the same story. The property maps, the county records, the messages, the notices, the recordings from my security cameras. None of them supported Meredith's claims. In fact, they showed something completely different. A private organization had acted as if it had authority over land it had no connection to. I watched the officials examine each piece of information carefully. There was no anger in their faces, no dramatic reaction, just the quiet seriousness of people realizing a line had been crossed. Meredith sat across from me, her hands folded tightly over her clipboard. That clipboard had once been her symbol of control. Now it looked like a reminder of every mistake she had made. One official looked at her and asked, "Can you provide any documentation showing your organization has jurisdiction over Mr. Holloway's property?" Meredith immediately responded, "The association has always maintained standards for the surrounding area." The official didn't raise his voice. He simply asked again. That was not my question. The room became still. It was the first time I saw Meredith without an answer ready. She looked through her papers, searching for something that didn't exist. After a few seconds, she said, "We believed we had the authority." That sentence changed everything. Because belief was not authority. Confidence was not authority. A uniform was not authority. The truth was finally separating appearance from reality. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The evidence was speaking for me. After the meeting, the officials requested additional copies of the records and informed me they would contact Ridgeview Estates directly. I returned home that evening as the sun was setting behind the trees along my property line. The same road where Meredith's patrol vehicle had entered weeks earlier was quiet again. No flashing lights. No unwanted visitors. Just the sound of wind moving through the branches and the familiar gravel beneath my boots. But I knew this wasn't over. People who lose control often try one final move. And Meredith proved me right. The next week, Ridgeview's board sent a letter to every homeowner in the community. They described the situation as a misunderstanding and claimed that certain individuals had created unnecessary conflict. They never mentioned my name, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. What they didn't expect was that some residents had started asking questions. A few homeowners contacted me privately. They told me Meredith had used similar tactics before, just never against someone willing to challenge her. They had assumed the notices were legitimate because they looked official. They had assumed the patrol vehicle meant power. They had assumed nobody would question it. I shared only what I could prove. I showed them the documents. I explained the timeline. I let the facts speak. Within days, more residents began reviewing their own situations. Suddenly, Meredith's problem was no longer one homeowner refusing to comply. It was an entire community realizing they had trusted an image instead of verifying the truth. That was the moment I understood something important. Meredith hadn't only overestimated her authority. She had underestimated everyone else's ability to think for themselves. The same tactics she used to control people were now the reason people started looking closer. And when people start asking questions, false power rarely survives for long. The final mistake Meredith Caldwell made was believing she could rewrite the story after the evidence had already spoken. But once the truth reaches enough people, no amount of polished letters or confident speeches can put it back in the shadows. After the county review, I expected Ridgeview Estates to finally accept reality. Instead, they tried to protect the image they had spent years building. The next several weeks revealed something I hadn't fully understood at the beginning. Meredith wasn't just acting alone. She was part of a system where people had become comfortable with authority going unchallenged. The patrol vehicle, the paperwork, the warnings, and the confident language had created an illusion that many residents accepted without question. But once that illusion cracked, people started looking deeper. One evening, I received a phone call from a Ridgeview homeowner named Daniel Mercer. His voice sounded frustrated but relieved at the same time. He told me he had received multiple compliance notices over the years for issues on his own property. He had always paid the requested fees because he assumed the association had the right to enforce them. "I never thought to ask for proof," he admitted. That sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly how these situations continued. Not because everyone agreed. Because most people didn't know they were allowed to question. I explained that I could only share what I had documented, and I sent him copies of the public records confirming my property boundaries. After that, more homeowners reached out. Each person had a different story, but the pattern was familiar. Confusing notices. Pressure. The assumption that the association's word was automatically final. Meredith had built her influence by making people feel like resistance was pointless. Now those same people were realizing they had options. Meanwhile, Ridgeview's leadership started distancing themselves from the patrol operation. The same organization that once proudly displayed the patrol vehicles began claiming Meredith had acted independently. I wasn't surprised. When a strategy fails, people often separate themselves from the person who carried it out. But the records showed a different story. Emails, schedules, communications. Everything connected back to decisions made by multiple people, not just Meredith. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. A month later, another meeting was scheduled. This time, residents requested it. They weren't there to listen quietly. They came with questions. I arrived early and stood near the back of the room. I didn't want attention. I wanted the truth to stand on its own. Meredith entered several minutes later. She looked different. The confidence was replaced by caution. The clipboard was gone. The patrol jacket was gone. Without those symbols, she looked like anyone else in the room. The meeting began with residents asking direct questions. Why were notices sent outside the association boundaries? Who approved the patrol visits? What authority supported these actions? Meredith tried to explain that mistakes had been made and that everyone needed to move forward. But the room had changed. People were no longer accepting vague answers. They wanted facts. One resident stood up and said something I would never forget. We trusted the appearance of authority instead of verifying the authority itself. That was the moment I knew the real victory had already happened. It wasn't about embarrassing Meredith. It wasn't about making someone lose. It was about reminding ordinary people that rights don't disappear just because someone speaks confidently. As I walked out of that meeting, the evening air felt lighter. The same road where the fake patrol vehicle once arrived with flashing lights was now quiet. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like my property wasn't just defended. It was respected. I thought the hardest part of this fight would be proving Meredith Caldwell was wrong. I was mistaken. The hardest part was watching ordinary people realize how easily they had accepted power without ever asking where that power came from. After everything that happened, I never looked at my property the same way again. The land was still the same. The old barn still stood beneath the tall trees. The gravel road still curved toward the entrance gate. But the feeling had changed. That road was no longer just an access point to my home. It was the place where someone tried to convince me that confidence was the same thing as authority. And it was the place where I learned that truth has a way of catching up with anyone who builds their actions on assumptions. A few months later, Ridgeview Estates officially ended the patrol program. The marked vehicle disappeared. The uniforms disappeared. The fake inspections stopped. There was no dramatic announcement or public apology. For Meredith, people like her rarely admit they were wrong when the evidence already says it for them. But the results were impossible to ignore. Residents who once stayed silent started participating in meetings. Homeowners began requesting documentation before accepting new rules. The questions changed from "what do we have to do?" to "what gives you the authority to require it?" That was the real victory. Not seeing Meredith lose control. Not watching the patrol vehicle leave. The real victory was seeing people understand that respect for rules only works when those rules are legitimate. One evening, I was standing near my fence line watching the sunset disappear behind the hills when my neighbor Daniel stopped by. He looked toward the road and smiled. "You know what's strange?" he said. "A few months ago, everyone thought that patrol truck represented power." I nodded. "And now?" He looked back at my property. "Now everyone knows it was just a truck." That sentence stayed with me. Because he was right. The entire illusion depended on people believing what they saw without questioning it. The logo, the uniform, the paperwork, the confident voice. Those things created an image. But an image is not the same as truth. Looking back, I could have handled things differently. I could have argued louder. I could have responded with anger when Meredith first entered my property. I could have tried to embarrass her in front of everyone. But that would have played into the exact situation she wanted. Instead, I stayed calm. I documented everything. I let every decision she made become part of the record. And eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. Meredith Caldwell believed she had chosen an easy target. She thought a quiet homeowner would step aside when faced with a patrol vehicle and a confident demand. She never realized that the person standing in front of her understood the difference between real authority and a performance of authority. Today, that same property remains peaceful. The gate stays closed unless invited guests arrive. The cameras continue recording. The land remains protected. But the biggest thing I gained was not a legal victory. It was a reminder that people do not lose their rights simply because someone speaks with confidence. Power must have limits. Rules must have foundations. And authority must be earned. Meredith thought she was teaching me to follow her rules. Instead, she taught an entire community to ask better questions. And in the end, that was the moment she truly lost. Because fake authority can intimidate people for a while. But once the truth arrives, it has nowhere left to hide.